On a frozen February morning in 1240, a Mongol tumen, 10,000 cavalry, rode across the ice-covered Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine, pursuing scattered Rus forces fleeing the destruction of Kiev. The Mongols had spent 3 years systematically destroying every major city in the Rus territories, killing hundreds of thousands, burning Vladimir, Ryazan, Suzdal, and finally Kiev itself in December 1239. The Rus princes and their armies had been crushed in every major battle. The Mongols believed organized resistance was finished. They were hunting survivors. But as the Mongol cavalry reached the middle of the frozen river, 2 miles from either bank, Rus warriors emerged from ice fishing holes they had cut the night before. These were the grandsons and great-grandsons of Vikings, descendants of the Norsemen who had founded the Kievan Rus state 4 centuries earlier, and they still remembered the old ways of winter warfare. They had spent the night beneath the ice, breathing through reeds, wading in water so cold it should have killed them. Now they erupted from the river with axes, spears, and pure rage, attacking from below while the Mongol horses panicked on the treacherous ice. Simultaneously, Rus archers hidden in the tree lines on both riverbanks began shooting, and teams of men with logs and hammers started breaking the ice at strategic points, creating open water that swallowed horses and riders. For perhaps 30 minutes, the Mongols, who had conquered from China to Eastern Europe, who had never been defeated in winter conditions, who considered themselves the greatest cavalry force in history, were trapped on breaking ice being ambushed by warriors who fought like their Viking ancestors. Brutal, cunning, and utterly without mercy. Several hundred Mongols died that morning, drowned in freezing water or cut down on the ice. It was a tactical victory that changed nothing strategically because the Mongol conquest was already complete, but it sent a message. Even in defeat, the Rus would make the Mongols bleed. To understand how Rus warriors could even attempt to ambush Mongol forces in 1240, you must understand the catastrophic situation the Rus territories faced. The Mongol invasion had begun in 1237 under Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, commanding perhaps 120,000 to 150,000 Mongol and subject troops. This was one of the largest armies the Mongols had ever fielded in the West. The Rus lands were divided into numerous competing principalities: Vladimir, Suzdal, Chernihiv, Kiev, Galicia, Volhynia, Novgorod, ruled by princes who spent more time fighting each other than cooperating against external threats. When the Mongols arrived in the winter of 1237 to 1238, they exploited this disunity brutally. The Mongols attacked in winter, when frozen rivers became highways for cavalry and when defenders expected invaders to wait for spring. They moved with terrifying speed, besieging and destroying cities in days rather than weeks. Ryazan fell in December 1237 after 5 days of siege, its entire population massacred. Vladimir fell in February 1238, burned with its grand prince's family inside the cathedral. Suzdal, Yaroslavl, Tver, all destroyed. The Mongols used psychological terror deliberately, leaving survivors to spread stories of the slaughter, breaking the will to resist. The Rus military was based on the druzhina system, where each prince maintained a professional warrior retinue supplemented by levies. These druzhiniks were descendants of Viking warriors, well-armored cavalry and infantry trained in both Norse and Eastern European fighting styles. But they were organized regionally and rarely cooperated. When Rus princes did unite to fight the Mongols, they were destroyed. At the Battle of the Sit River in March 1238, the Mongols annihilated a coalition Rus army, killing Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir and most of his nobles. The battle demonstrated Mongol tactical superiority. Feigned retreats that drew Rus cavalry into ambushes, horse archery that struck from range before Rus heavy cavalry could close, and perfect coordination between Mongol units that exploited every Rus mistake. After the Sit River, organized Rus resistance in the north collapsed. The Mongols withdrew for the summer of 1238 to rest their horses and consolidate control, then returned in 1239 to conquer southern Rus territories. By late 1239, Kiev, the ancient capital, the mother of Rus cities, was under siege. Kiev fell in December 1239 after weeks of bombardment by Mongol siege engines. The city, which had been one of medieval Europe's largest and wealthiest, was burned and depopulated. Contemporary sources describe the city as so completely destroyed that when a papal envoy passed through years later, he found only ruins and bones. Tens of thousands of Kievans were killed or enslaved. The destruction of Kiev marked the effective end of the Kievan Rus state. By early 1240, the Mongols controlled all major Rus territories except Novgorod, which had been spared because spring flooding made the region inaccessible to Mongol cavalry. The surviving Rus princes submitted to Mongol overlordship and agreed to pay tribute. Organized resistance was finished. But scattered throughout the forests, swamps, and river valleys of Rus lands were groups of survivors, Druzina warriors who had escaped destroyed cities, peasants whose villages had been burned, urban refugees who refused to submit. These people had nothing left to lose. Many were descendants of the Vikings who had founded the Rus state in the 9th century, and in their desperation, they reverted to the guerrilla warfare and winter survival skills their Norse ancestors had used. They became what later Russians would call partisans, small bands fighting a hopeless resistance against an unstoppable conqueror. The winter of 1239 to 1240 saw scattered acts of resistance across the conquered territories. Small bands of Rus warriors ambushed Mongol patrols, burned supply depots, and assassinated Mongol officials. They used their knowledge of local terrain, dense forests, frozen rivers, hidden swamps, to strike and disappear before Mongol cavalry could respond. The Mongols, despite their military genius, were vulnerable in certain conditions. Their strength was mobility, but mobility was limited in deep snow and on uncertain ice. Their horses, though hardy, struggled in the extreme cold of a Rus winter and couldn't forage when the ground was frozen. Mongol logistics relied on rapid movement and living off the land, but in winter this was difficult. The Rus partisans exploited these weaknesses. They struck at night during blizzards when Mongol sentries couldn't see. They poisoned water sources the Mongols used. They set forest fires that destroyed Mongol camps. And most effectively, they used the frozen rivers. The great rivers of Rus lands, the Dnieper, Volga, Don, froze solid in winter, creating natural highways that Mongol cavalry used to move quickly. But ice is treacherous. It can be weakened, broken, and turned into a death trap. The Rus warriors knew this. The Mongols learned it the hard way. The ambush on the Dnieper River in February 1240 was one of several such attacks that winter, but it was the most audacious and successful. The details come from fragmentary sources, Russian chronicles that mention Polovtsian and Rus warriors who drowned Tatars in the ice and later legends that romanticize the resistance. But the tactical approach is consistent across sources and fits with both Rus and Viking winter warfare traditions. The plan was conceived by a group of surviving Druzina warriors led by a minor noble whose name is lost to history but who understood both Mongol tactics and winter survival. The Rus partisans knew that a Mongol tumen was crossing the Dnieper River in pursuit of refugees fleeing toward Galicia. The river was frozen solid, thick ice that could support cavalry. The Mongols would cross quickly, 2 miles of ice between the wooded banks. The Rus plan was to turn that crossing into a killing ground using tactics that were part Norse berserker raid, part desperate improvisation, and entirely suicidal. They would ambush the Mongols on the ice using warriors hidden beneath the river itself. The preparation for this ambush required surviving conditions that would kill most people. The night before the Mongol crossing, perhaps 100 Rus warriors cut breathing holes in the river ice 2 feet thick, using axes and saws taken from destroyed villages. They made the holes small, only inches across, disguised with thin ice and snow. Then they entered the water. The Dnieper River in February is perhaps 33 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. Immersion in water this cold causes immediate cold shock response, hyperventilation, increased heart rate, loss of dexterity. Within minutes, hypothermia begins. Within 15 to 30 minutes, Unconsciousness and death follow. The Rus warriors wore thick fur clothing soaked in animal fat to provide insulation. They tied themselves to ropes anchored on the riverbed to prevent drifting under the ice. They breathed through hollow reeds thrust up through the breathing holes, a technique that Norse warriors had allegedly used in river crossings centuries earlier. Some sources suggest they drank alcohol to suppress the cold shock response, though this is more likely legend than fact. What is certain is that they spent at least 6 to 8 hours in near-freezing water, barely conscious, slowly dying from hypothermia, waiting for the Mongol cavalry to cross above them. Many did die. Sources suggest that of 100 warriors who entered the water, perhaps 30 to 40 were already dead by the time the ambush started. But the survivors remained in position because they had nothing left to live for except revenge. When the Mongol tumen began crossing the frozen Dnieper around mid-morning, they were moving fast, 10,000 cavalry in a long column spread across the ice to distribute weight. Mongol scouts had checked the ice thickness and deemed it safe. The column was perhaps a mile long, stretched between the riverbanks. This was when the Rus sprung their trap. Warriors still alive beneath the ice used knives to break through the breathing holes, widening them from below. They erupted from the water, hypothermic, barely able to move, but driven by rage and desperation, and immediately attacked the nearest Mongol horses. The shock value was immense. Mongol cavalry suddenly saw blue-faced, frost-covered warriors emerging from solid ice, appearing like demons from below. The horses panicked. Mongol discipline, usually unbreakable, faltered because the attack came from an impossible direction. Horses reared, broke formation, and slipped on the ice. The Rus warriors, knowing they were dead anyway from hypothermia, fought with suicidal fury. They hamstrung horses with axes, pulled riders from saddles, and used their bodies to block Mongol movements. They weren't trying to win, they were trying to create chaos. Simultaneously, the second phase of the ambush activated. Rus archers hidden in the tree lines on both riverbanks, perhaps 200 bowmen, began shooting at the Mongol column. They targeted the middle of the formation, creating casualties and panic in the densest part of the column. The Mongols, excellent horse archers themselves, tried to return fire, but shooting from horseback on slippery ice against targets in tree cover achieved little. More importantly, the archery forced Mongols to bunch together, concentrating weight on the ice. This was when the third phase began. Rus teams positioned at strategic points along the riverbanks started breaking the ice. They used logs as battering rams, hammers, and in some places, fires built the night before that had weakened the ice from below. The ice, already stressed by the weight of 10,000 horses and riders, began to crack. Fracture lines spread across the river. Open water appeared. Mongol cavalry, trained to maneuver on any terrain, found themselves on breaking ice with horses falling through into freezing water. A Mongol warrior in leather and lamellar armor weighed enough that breaking through ice meant immediate drowning, dragged down by equipment, and unable to swim in freezing water. Horses that fell through the ice died in seconds from cold shock. The disciplined Mongol column disintegrated into panic. The Mongols attempted to respond with their standard tactical brilliance, but the situation was beyond their experience. Mongol commanders tried to organize defensive circles, but formations couldn't hold on cracking ice. They tried to withdraw toward the riverbanks, but the Rus archers targeted anyone approaching the tree lines. They tried to charge through the ambush toward the opposite bank, but the ice ahead was being systematically broken by Rus teams. For perhaps 20 to 30 minutes, the Mongol tumen was trapped in a nightmare scenario. Ice breaking beneath them, freezing water swallowing horses and men, half-dead Rus warriors attacking from the water, arrows falling from the forests, and no clear path to safety. Contemporary sources describe the screaming of drowning horses and men being audible for miles. The Dnieper River, frozen solid, became an open water grave dotted with ice floes and corpses. Eventually, Mongol discipline reasserted itself. Commanders organized a fighting retreat, accepting heavy casualties to extract survivors. Perhaps 700 to 800 Mongol cavalry were killed, drowned, or froze to death. The remaining Mongols reached the southern riverbank and established a defensive position. The Rus warriors, having achieved their goal of killing Mongols and creating a spectacular ambush, withdrew into the forests before the Mongols could organize a pursuit. Most of the Rus warriors who had hidden beneath the ice died, either during the hours underwater or shortly after from hypothermia. They had known they were dead the moment they entered the water. The ambush was a calculated suicide mission that inflicted a tactical defeat on the Mongols. The strategic impact of the Dnieper ambush was negligible. The Mongol conquest continued. Batu Khan's forces completed their subjugation of the Rus lands and moved west into Hungary and Poland in 1241. The Rus territories would remain under Mongol control for the next 2 centuries, paying tribute to what became known as the Golden Horde. The princes who survived became vassals. Rus culture and politics were profoundly shaped by the Mongol occupation. But the ambush, and others like it, had psychological impact. The Mongols learned that even in victory, occupying the Rus lands would be costly. Winter ambushes continued sporadically throughout the 1240s. The Mongols adapted, moving smaller forces, avoiding rivers in winter, and conducting brutal reprisals against any village suspected of harboring partisans. But they never again moved with the same confidence through Rus territories in winter. The image of warriors emerging from beneath the ice to kill Mongols entered Rus folklore and later Russian national mythology. It became a symbol of resistance against impossible odds, of fighting to the death rather than submitting, of using the harsh land itself as a weapon. The Dnieper ambush also represents a continuity with Viking warfare traditions. The Rus state had been founded by Varangian Vikings in the 9th century, when Norse chieftain Rurik established control over Novgorod and his successor Oleg took Kiev in 882. Over the following centuries, the Norse ruling class intermarried with Slavic populations, adopted Orthodox Christianity, and became culturally Slavic while retaining some Norse military traditions. The tactic of hiding beneath ice using breathing reeds has parallels in Norse sagas describing similar ambushes in Scandinavian rivers and fjords. The berserker tradition of fighting in suicidal fury, accepting death to inflict maximum casualties, echoes in the behavior of the Rus warriors who spent hours in freezing water knowing they would die. The use of terrain and winter conditions against more numerous enemies was standard Norse practice, refined over centuries of raiding and warfare in harsh climates. The Mongols, for all their military genius, had never faced opponents who thought and fought like Vikings. The steppes of Central Asia where Mongol warfare evolved were cold, but not forested. The Mongols fought in winter, but on open ground where cavalry could maneuver. The dense forests, deep snows, frozen rivers, and inhospitable swamps of Rus territories were novel terrain, and the Rus warriors who knew how to exploit these conditions could inflict casualties that traditional steppe warfare couldn't prepare the Mongols for. The human cost of the resistance was catastrophic for the Rus. The Mongol invasion killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 the population of Rus territories, hundreds of thousands of people dead from warfare, starvation, disease, and enslavement. The destroyed cities took decades to rebuild, and some never recovered. The political fragmentation of the Rus lands was permanent when the Mongol yoke eventually ended in the 15th century. It was Muscovy, Moscow, that emerged as the dominant power, not Kiev. The cultural trauma of the Mongol invasion shaped Russian historical consciousness for centuries. Later Russian historiography often portrayed the Mongol period as a dark age that delayed Russia's development compared to Western Europe. Modern historians recognize this as oversimplified. Mongol rule brought trade connections, administrative innovations, and military techniques that influenced Russian state development, but the immediate impact of the invasion was devastation. The ambushes and resistance, while tactically successful in isolated incidents, couldn't prevent the occupation and did not significantly alter the strategic outcome. But they provided a psychological counternarrative to total submission, a story of resistance that would be remembered. The Mongol perspective on these ambushes is harder to reconstruct because Mongol sources rarely discuss defeats or difficulties, focusing instead on conquests and victories. But the Mongols clearly respected the Rus as dangerous enemies. Unlike some territories where Mongol conquest led to immediate pacification, the Rus lands required continued military presence for decades. Mongol census takers and tribute collectors traveled with armed escorts. Mongol garrisons were positioned strategically throughout the territory. The Golden Horde's relationship with the Rus principalities was complex. The Mongols allowed local princes to rule in exchange for tribute and military support, but they intervened brutally if rebellion occurred. The fact that the Mongols chose to govern through vassal princes rather than direct administration suggests they recognized the difficulty of controlling the region. The winter ambushes were part of this calculation. Fighting the Rus in their own territory, in winter, in forests and swamps, was costly. Allowing local princes to maintain order was more efficient. This system lasted until the Golden Horde weakened in the 14th and 15th centuries, when Rus princes gradually asserted independence. The mythology around the Dnieper ambush and similar incidents grew over centuries. In the 16th century, Russian chronicles described the Mongol period with growing nationalistic interpretation, emphasizing Russian resistance and suffering under the Tatar yoke. The story of warriors hiding beneath ice to ambush Mongols became a popular tale, embellished with details that are historically questionable but symbolically powerful. By the 19th century, Russian Romantic nationalism had transformed these stories into heroic legends. Soviet historiography, while officially atheistic and scientific, preserved these narratives as examples of popular resistance against foreign invaders, a theme that fit communist ideology. Modern Russian national identity still references the Mongol period as a crucible that forged Russian resilience. The historical reality that the Mongol conquest was total, the occupation lasted centuries, and the resistance was largely ineffective, is less emphasized in popular culture than the symbolic importance of fighting back against impossible odds. The archaeological evidence for these specific winter ambushes is minimal. Battles on frozen rivers leave little trace because corpses and equipment sink or are washed away when ice melts. No mass graves associated with the Dnieper ambush have been discovered, though given the locations described in sources were remote and have been heavily developed over centuries, this is unsurprising. Archaeological work on Mongol period Rus has focused on destroyed cities and Mongol fortifications rather than battlefields. What evidence exists comes from the cities. Layers of ash and destruction dated to 1237 to 1240, mass graves with evidence of violent death, caches of hidden valuables that were never recovered, churches burned with populations inside. The material culture confirms the chronicle's descriptions of catastrophic destruction. The Rus resistance, including the winter ambushes, operated in the shadows of this destruction, small acts of defiance amid overwhelming defeat. On that February morning in 1240, when blue-faced Rus warriors emerged from beneath the ice of the Dnieper River to attack Mongol cavalry, they knew they were dead already. Hours in freezing water had doomed them to hypothermia. The ambush wasn't about survival, it was about vengeance. They killed several hundred Mongols, creating panic in an army that had conquered from the Pacific to Eastern Europe. They used the frozen river, the brutal winter, and their knowledge of terrain to turn Mongol tactical advantages into vulnerabilities. They fought like their Viking ancestors, cunning, brutal, and willing to die inflicting maximum casualties. It changed nothing strategically. The Mongol conquest was complete. The Rus lands would pay tribute for 2 centuries. But it sent a message. Even in defeat, the Rus would make their conquerors bleed. The grandsons of Vikings, fighting as Rus warriors in 1240, proved that no conquest is absolute when the defeated refuse to submit. The Mongols ruled the Rus lands, but they never ruled them comfortably. And in the frozen rivers, dense forests, and winter storms of that harsh land, the descendants of Norsemen would always be waiting to kill them,